Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time and inform the most relevant, compelling, and challenging conversations. Here we offer first-person access to dynamic political, business, and public personality.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Kirsch Allen, Director of the Canadian Club, and your event host. For those tuning in via canadianclub.org, a heartfelt welcome. This season, we've had the pleasure of hosting over 8,500 guests, and we're immensely proud of the meaningful dialogues we've fostered. Just last week, our agenda was brimming with discussions. Kudos to the team for running 3 events last week. Notably, a pivotal discourse on housing that instilled a sense of optimism in our ability to tackle this pressing issue in Canada. We were privileged to gain insights from esteemed speakers, including Paul Desmarais III, Chair and CEO of Sagard, and Tony Staffieri, CEO of Rogers Communications. We appreciate the Canadian Bankers Association for their season-long sponsorship. We are thankful to Air Canada, our official airline sponsor, and Canada's Forest Trust Corporation is partnering with our club to help reduce our carbon footprint by planting and stewarding a forest in our honor. Our event today is generously sponsored by Johnson & Johnson. Thank you for your support. We regularly invite young leaders to participate in our events, and today we welcome a table from Toronto Metropolitan University and Humber College. Thank you for joining us. Now, before introducing our panelists, I'll remind you that our events involve you as audience members as well. What questions about Canada's economic resilience do you have for our panelists? Please use the question cards found on your tables, and our teams will collect them and have your questions addressed. And for those joining remotely, please hit, quote, the Submit a Question button on the right side of your screen. Our team will share these questions with our moderator as well. It's time to introduce our panelists. This is the most fun part for me. Janet is a founder and general partner of Staircase Ventures, which invests in Canada's most promising early-stage tech companies. Prior to launching Staircase, Janet was managing partner at Real Ventures, one of Canada's largest and most active early-stage investors. Janet is very active in the Canadian tech ecosystem. She's the co-chair of C100 and on the boards of the Ivey Business School and LEAP, a social venture accelerator. Trevor Dauphiné is a leader with a unique blend of experience from both the private and public sectors. The Invest Ontario CEO has over a decade of experience in the automotive, chemical, and consulting sectors, including extensive sales and account management with Dow Chemical. Trevor has also held executive leadership positions at the Ontario Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, Treasury Board Secretariat, and the Ministry of Infrastructure, specializing in investment, attraction, and capital planning. Barclay Vincent is a dynamic leader with more than 20 years of global pharmaceutical and healthcare experience. As the president of Janssen Incorporated, he leads a diverse workforce of employees across Canada who are actively committed to making a difference for patients and shaping change to improve the Canadian healthcare ecosystem. He also serves as a member of the Board of Directors for Innovative Medicines Canada, the national association representing the voice of Canada's innovative pharmaceutical industry. Simon Kennedy was named Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, ISED, in 2019. Previously, he served as Deputy Minister of Health. Kennedy began his career with the public service in 1990 and has served in a variety of progressively senior roles in 7 different organizations, including in 6 deputy minister level appointments at the Privy Council Office, Industry Canada, Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Health Canada, and Innovation, Science and Economic Development. He also served as the Prime Minister's personal representative, or Sherpa, to the G20 from 2012 to 2014. Moderating today's panel is Jody Butts, a partner at Watson where she leads governance reviews, board and director evaluations, board director searches, and advises boards and executives on a broad range of governance effectiveness matters. She brings more than 20 years of experience in governance and law to her role. We're going to begin with remarks from the Deputy Minister, and then Jody and our panelists will engage in conversation. To begin, Simon, the Canadian Club podium is yours.
Many thanks for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Canadian Club for having me here with you today. It's a very short podium for someone who's 6'2". I'm from Ottawa, and I'm here to help you. Non, mais sérieusement, je sais que c'est une audience aujourd'hui à Toronto, et c'est presque certain que le monde ici est presque tout anglophone, mais je veux juste commencer à vous offrir quelques mots en français. Alors, je suis vraiment content d'être ici avec vous pour cette discussion importante. I've been a civil servant, as has been noted, for close to 35 years now, in a variety of different roles. And I have to say, I think it's been probably the last number of years have been the busiest and in some respects the most dynamic of my entire career. And I think a lot of my colleagues feel the same way. And when I was asked if I would participate in today's conversation, I thought I'd just, try to give a little bit of a reflection of what people like me who are involved in economic policy in Ottawa, what we see happening, and what it is that we're excited about for Canada's future, the things that worry us, and maybe try to paint a broad picture of some of the opportunities and challenges and how policymakers in places like Ottawa are thinking about it. So this is kind of my take, but I'd like to think it's a reasonable distillation of the kinds of things that policymakers are trying to do to support the Canadian economy. So it is a gross oversimplification, but I would say that you can boil down a lot of the activities and a lot of the legislation and a lot of the announcements that you see in the newspaper, that there are kind of 3 broad forces at work behind the kinds of things that at least governments are doing. It'd be great to compare notes with the business folks in the room, but to try to prepare the Canadian economy and Canada for success into the future. And I will give you this kind of distillation. It's a bit of a bumper sticker, but effectively you can kind of boil down the big changes in the world to 3, 3 big tectonic forces that are affecting the economy, and they're all happening more or less at the same time, and there are really important linkages between them. So the first one is the shift towards green and sustainability. This has been on the agenda a very long time, but I think it's fair to say that we have, certainly I have never seen anything like the kind of movement over the last number of years towards major investments to kind of get ready for a net zero future. And a really a vivid example of this would be the automotive sector, not just in Canada but around the world, where you have the largest corporations in the world in this space rushing to build new supply chains to support electric mobility and putting billions and billions of dollars of capital at risk to build these new supply chains in an environment of, frankly, relative uncertainty. We don't know entirely what the future market will look like. We don't know entirely about, for example, the electric grid and the systems that are needed to support these new products. Governments are working on that, to be sure, but it's just to say the amount of capital going in and the speed at which it's going in is really revolutionary and transformative. And certainly my sense is that these corporations have decided that this is where the future is, And the risk of actually waiting to see exactly where things shake out is much higher than the risk of not moving. If you don't move, you're going to be left behind. So that's one example. So green and sustainability, a huge tectonic force affecting investors, corporates, governments, citizens are increasingly demanding it. And that shows up in all kinds of areas. The second one is something we've been talking about for a long time. My own personal view is the pandemic has really turbocharged it, and then AI, these frontier technologies, and in particular artificial intelligence, are really driving this like never before. But that is the rise of digital and data as fundamental elements of competitive advantage in the economy, to the point where even if you're in a so-called traditional business, whether you're in, I don't know, mining or agriculture, increasingly the views in that industry or in those industries are, in order to be able to figure out how to better, plant and harvest and get better value out of the crop, how to be a better and more responsible miner, how to make better use of the assets you have, these inventories that are on your balance sheet. It's the ability to use the data and the ability to use technology to actually, beat out your competitor and be better at what you do. And we are seeing this all across the board, that digital and data is becoming, in a sense, it's kind of like a new factor of competitive advantage. It's a kind of important, really crucial input to productivity. And the last force I would note, again, I think we really saw this turbocharged in the last couple of years. My own personal view is the pandemic. We all experienced the pandemic. We all, I'm sure almost all of us wound up spending a lot of time, looking at a screen and speaking to people over video for a very long period of time. But that phenomenon is the increasing importance of resiliency and security in our supply chains and in how the economy is actually organized. And I would say, just to give you an example, but I was very actively involved, along with a lot of other colleagues, in supporting the government in the management of the pandemic. And so I was one player, but a pretty, upfront seat into the efforts of the government to secure vaccines and personal protective equipment and other kinds of goods and so on that are necessary to protect Canadians. And I can tell you, it was very, very instructive to see just how thin some of our supply chains are, and how reliant our country is, and not just us, but other advanced, economies, very large, sophisticated economies, how reliant they were on a single factory on the other side of the world, or on the goodwill of neighbors to make sure that goods and services were flowing, even in a time when populations were demanding that they get looked after first. And so I think, policymakers had this kind of vivid real-time example of the vulnerability of even an advanced economy. And we've always, Canada's a leader in free trade. We have these relationships all around the world. But when the chips are down in an emergency, there are certain risks if you don't have resiliency built into your supply chain. So green, digital, and resilient, huge driving forces. So I was told to keep my remarks short. So what I will say is this is a challenge. It's a challenge for Canada, and it's a challenge that perhaps is greater for us than some other peer nations. I wouldn't make a claim one way or the other, but I would just say if you look, for example, at where some of the real sources of growth have been for our economy, since the Second World War, certainly for the last number of decades, we have relied extensively on increases in the labor supply. I mean, increases in multi-factor productivity, use of technology, and so on were important, but they weren't nearly as important, frankly, as the huge entry into the workforce of women, the huge entry into the workforce of the baby boomers, and so on. If you look at kind of how our economy has succeeded, we've done pretty well. Canada's been a rich country, and our firms have been profitable, but the sources of our growth have not typically been, significant advances in innovative new technologies and really pushing the frontier. We have been, this is a gross oversimplification, but we have this huge and important resource endowment, and we've had a huge entry of people into the labor market, and those have been important sources of growth. I mentioned resources. We are blessed as a country. We have huge resource endowments. That is a potentially enormous opportunity. There are also risks there in a world that has increasing demands around carbon, increasing expectations around sustainability. And we are next door to the world's largest and most dynamic economy, with which we have a free trade agreement. So we have been blessed to have easy access to international markets. But in a world of increasing shifts and pressures on green, on adoption of digital technologies, and on changing dynamics around supply chains, all of those things are a potential challenge. We can't necessarily imagine that we can be entirely reliant on traditional trade relationships when all these supply chains are changing, for critical minerals, for semiconductors, for access to computing firepower for AI. We can't necessarily continue to rely on increases in the labor supply in a world where a kind of brain power and innovation is going to be increasingly important because of labor shortages. And on our resource base, we have to make sure that we're taking advantage of our kind of knowledge and that resource base, but in new ways. So those are challenges, but there are also huge opportunities. We have tremendous expertise in energy and resources. We have huge stores of green energy. We have a highly skilled workforce. We are leaders in frontier technology like artificial intelligence. Some of the founders of the field are Canadian. And we have free trade deals with more than any other country practically on Earth. So we are very well positioned to navigate through these tectonic forces, but the future is not certain. And a lot of the policy work that's underway now is really, and we can all have a debate about, how well we're doing. Certainly, I'm open to criticism, but I would just say that a lot of the effort that you see, certainly from my ministry, and a lot of the things that have been generating a lot of headlines are really designed to take advantage of those opportunities and to kind of respond to those forces. So I'll give you two quick examples and then I'll stop. Massive investments in electric vehicle supply chain. That is about the green future that we all want. It's also a huge resiliency, and it's a huge kind of supply chain security play. These supply chains are being built now, and when they're built, they're going to be in place for decades to come. And if we're not there at the table figuring out how to make sure Canada stays relevant in the automotive sector, there is some risk that we will be left behind as this entire industry transitions. Artificial intelligence, there was a major announcement in the federal government's budget of a significant investment in AI compute. AI has gone from being, this is again a simplification, focused mostly on research, where Canada has been a world leader, to very much now on application and the use of these generative platforms and the use of artificial intelligence to drive enormous advantage in the economy. And most of the leading thinkers think this is going to be potentially as big as electricity, affecting every business that's out there. And having the research capacity is very, very important, and that's a huge advantage for us. But you need the computing firepower to actually be able to train these models and apply them in the economy to actually do things that are important. And more important, you need the adoption by the business sector. And so if you look at, and one last thing I would say, is there's a significant resiliency and security issue associated with artificial intelligence too, because those compute resources are not evenly distributed all around the world. We can't go and kind of discover them in the north and they're there. They are currently built and exist in a number of jurisdictions. But if we want to make sure that Canada has access to the compute firepower needed for the AI future, we need to make sure we have a sovereign capacity to use that. So the budget invested significantly in access to AI compute and sovereign compute. Again, this is about our digital future. It's also about resiliency of the economy in a world of really shifting supply chains. So thank you for having me today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with the panel. I hope that was helpful, and thanks.
Simon, thank you so much for laying that out. You've tilled some fertile soil for us, I think, for this wonderful panel to explore. Janet, I'm going to ask you to kick us off. The topic is resiliency. Generally, when you think about resiliency, it's built on strengths. And you have this great investor perch. What do you see as Canada's strengths?
So it's a great question. Just for perspective, I launched a venture capital fund and I made the strategic decision to focus on investing in Canadian-based businesses. So I am very bullish on our opportunity to launch and build great tech companies in Canada. And to your point, in terms of the strengths, I would say three key things that help not only the tech startup ecosystem, but also our country broadly. First is our talent. As Simon alluded to, we are a top country in terms of technology. The two founding fathers are often called the godfathers of AI, are based in Canada. One is Joshua Bengio, based out of University of Montreal, and the other one is Jeff Hinton, based out of U of T. Those two men continue to teach in their universities. We have so many other great universities, including University of Waterloo, recognized around the world. So we just have great tech talent, and that is recognized when I go and talk to investors in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. They often talk about the amazing technical talent in Canada. So that would be number one. Number two is the access to global markets. When we invest in technology companies here in Canada, they are looking outside Canada from day one. Canada as a supplier is welcomed around the world. We are right next door to the largest commercial market in the world, and Canadian companies are able to access that market in other markets around the world. So I would say number two is the access to global markets. And the third is our society. And everything is not great in Canada. We all need to be fighting to improve this country. But we also need to recognize we live in a country that is democratic, free speech, is very tolerant, as at peace, and so we have a lot to be grateful for. And we need to say, hey, there's not a lot of places, unfortunately, in the world do not have those advantages right now.
Wonderful. That's a great way to kick off this conversation. Now, Trevor, I think maybe the resiliency of the economy is a little bit in your job description. So what do you see as the strengths when you think about the job that lies ahead for you? What do you draw upon?
So, what I'll say, though, just to start, obviously, my job is focused on Ontario, so we'll be a little Ontario-centric, but I think a lot of it sort of plays out from a broad-based perspective for the country. But, I think Janet did a great job of delineating what I think are some of the great sort of benefits from a resilience and what the strengths are that we can build on. If I could maybe just put a different twist on it, when I speak to investors, we talk about the skilled talent in the province. And we talk about the number of STEM grads. We put out 65,000. We talk about the post-secondary rate and the talent that means. I think, what does that really translate into? And I'll give you a great example. There was a large multinational pharma company that we were working with. They wanted to make a really giant investment in this province. And the decision wasn't informed by subsidies. It was informed by the fact that the people from that office here in Ontario went abroad to other countries, and they saw the value of that talent. And that company ended up making a 500-person investment in this province. I think it's exemplary in terms of the kinds of skills that we have from jobs and ability for our knowledge-based economy to get out there. The other thing that I would sort of riff a bit on that would be, when we talk to decision makers at companies, when they make a decision, do I want to go to Columbus, Ohio, or am I going to go to London, Ontario? They have a matrix that they weight, and obviously the business case is a huge, huge part of that. But you know what's also really important now that wasn't 5 and 10 years ago is ESG. We have a diverse population base and skill base in order to draw from, and I think it matters now. It matters for investors. The other thing, and I can't emphasize this enough, and I think the deputy sort of touched on it as well as Janet, but stability of Ontario has made us shine. Like, we're in a world of instability. 10 years ago, I didn't have the opportunities from an investment attraction perspective that I do now. And that is a consequence of the flag that we now put up in an unstable world. The value of that is 10 times what it was. And as a consequence, I think there is a ton of interest, and it's something that I think sort of sets us above other competing jurisdictions.
So it sounds like the table is well set. I think that's the message from our first two panelists. I'm going to start with you, Berkeley. The question I wanted to ask was, when I was reflecting on Simon's remarks, risks and opportunities are often just two sides of the same coin. So when you reflect on those remarks and you think about the job that you have today, is Canada focused on the right risks and opportunities?
So it's a great question. And on behalf of Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine, we've made our naming a little bit simpler to understand who we are, but that's who I'm here to represent today. As a large player in healthcare, I think what we see is many people adding health to that list of things that they've seen become central in the last couple of years. Obviously, the pandemic reminded everybody at the individual level, but I think at the sector or even at the country level, that criticality is understood. And so thinking about how do we make sure that the best medicines and technologies reach Canadians who need them, that's obviously a key piece of that we're very focused on. But on the other side of that, where we manufacture, where we invest to make those things come to life, where the next great innovation will come from, is also just as important. And I think it's very important not to take too many learnings from the pandemic and assume that we will know exactly what kind of technology we'll need.
Right.
True resiliency will come from having a wide portfolio of technologies, skills, and investments so that the criticality of Canada in that global health environment will be so strong that, just like auto is such a shining example today, that the US in particular, but just globally, would reckon with Ontario as investment in auto. I think there's an opportunity to bring some of that thinking also to healthcare.
Oh, that's a great reflection. So, Trevor, when you think about the sort of risks opportunities equation, what do you see? Do you mirror Simon's thoughts on this question, or would you add something to this list?
A little bit, but I wanted to actually respond to Barclay's comment and connect it back to the open borders question. So, we have CUSMA, we've got the European agreement, we have Asia now. I think that's unique, but during the pandemic, borders were closed. But we had one company in Guelph, Ontario that made Tylenol, and they were able to ship across the borders. And as a consequence, coming out of COVID, we got a pretty significant expansion in that facility. So I think open border policies and the approach from sort of a free trade perspective matters, and to thank Johnson & Johnson for that. So what I would say is, when I think big picture, I think yes. So if I take some of the comments that the deputy made when we talk about the EV supply chain, $43 billion that Ontario has seen flow into, basically a transformation for the industry. I think there is risk attached to that. Companies are making huge bets, but I think that this is the opportunity for us to think about linking the supply chain across the province. So the minerals in the north, right? How do we not just extract those and ship those abroad? How do we create the value chain that goes with that as much as we can in the province? And frankly, he is absolutely right. This is a time-limited thing, right? These are very large, sticky investments that we have to come to the table in order to land and negotiate and secure into this province. I think the other thing coming out of COVID that's kind of interesting still from my perspective is, it no longer matters to some degree where you are. There is kind of a hub and spoke approach, but when we talk to tech companies, for example, I don't just pitch Toronto and Waterloo and Ottawa. We say, well, what about London, Ontario, or Thunder Bay, right? And so that's an opportunity, but it also means that we're in direct competition with other locations, for example, like Austin, Texas, or Puerto Rico, right? And so I think it provides a bit of a unique thing. I think just to conclude, I know, Jody, we're supposed to keep our comments sort of very, very short, but I think Ontario, right, and Canada writ large we're unique. We are a global player in the automotive industry. We're a global player, second largest tech cluster in the world. We have the largest HMO in North America. We have the second largest financial district, and I think those things represent unique opportunities for the province. So what does that mean? That means fintech. It means autonomous vehicles. And I think those overlaps are really important because they're natural strengths and opportunities. And then the last piece, if I turn around the risk question, I think as a consequence, things like cybersecurity, that represents both a risk but also an opportunity for Canada, right? How do we construct the right kinds of companies so that we can both support cybersecurity but have the requisite skills to expand? So I apologize. I went on a little too long, Jody.
No. But I have to let Janet in to this. You can't drop cybersecurity and me go, okay, Janet, you just sort of over there and not comment on that, please.
You want me to cybersecurity specifically, or?
No. Yeah, I could just tell you wanted to add something to the conversation there.
No, I was just sort of, I was just thoughtful, but I think, no, that's okay. I don't need to add anything specifically on that. I think we can go on. Did you want me to touch a little bit about competition and resilience?
Yes, because I think, we can talk about risks and opportunities, we can talk about strengths, but how does competitiveness really mesh with resiliency?
So to me, competitiveness and resiliency are inseparable, right? They are so tightly linked, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about business or athletics or academics or whatever field, the more competition you have, the more you are going, the more, at least the winners are going to be forced to up their game and therefore in the process become more resilient. And so I think one of, and you just think about that, yeah, absolutely, it sort of makes sense. Yeah, if you have more competition in business, it forces the companies involved to think harder about their value proposition, work harder to meet the needs of their customers, work harder to reduce their costs so that they're not priced out of the market. I think where it comes then to Canada is one of the challenges with Canadian resiliency is in a lot of markets we do not have the same level of competitiveness as we do in the US. And so I think that is a challenge. And whether you talk about the banking industry, and it's fine to say, hey, we're one of the top financial markets, that's great. But you look at the competitiveness of our banks relative to the competitiveness and the speed with the US banks. And, I have a ton of respect for our Canadian banks. They are very resilient, they are strong, they are very well managed. However, they do not adopt technology nearly as quickly as the US banks. They are much more slower moving, right? And you can extend that. When I think about our companies, I hear it all the time. Our companies will say, hey, I go and talk to a Canadian company and I'll talk to them, and whether it's a bank or a manufacturing company or, you run down the list, and they'll have conversations after conversations after conversations. And then they go and call on a US company, and the US company will say, I like that idea, let's buy it and let's start implementing it because we got to get it. And by the way, we want to get it before our competitors. And so I think, where does that leave Canada? As I said, I'm a huge fan of Canada, but I think we as a country need to get more competitive, right? We need to move faster with adopting technologies, because otherwise we're going to be left behind when we think about the global stage.
Oh, thank you for that. I'm going to ask Berkeley to jump in on this one. When we think about competitiveness, the life sciences were such a focus for everybody, right? At that individual level, when you think about Canada and its prospects and in a global context, how do we stack up, and what would be your thoughts on maybe how we could move forward effectively?
So I think the thing that's moving the most in the recent years, and Simon touched on it, but I do think it bears repeating, is the geopolitical landscape is changing really quite fundamentally. And I think that offers actually huge opportunities to Canada. There's obviously a very, very large and important healthcare market just across the border. Mm-hmm. They're thinking differently about, their biosecurity. That's a key part of everything else that they're assessing. And I think that, there's obviously examples outside of healthcare of how the centrality of Canada has played very strongly to Canada's advantage. And I think that in healthcare and life sciences, there's really opportunities, lots of skills, lots of, that intellectual firepower, but maybe the opportunity to match that with industrial base, investment, jobs, all the things that I know many people on this panel care deeply about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well said. Simon, I have a question for you from the audience. The audience member is asking about productivity. So we just talked about how does competitiveness mesh with resiliency. What about productivity? And Janet's comments also touched upon that issue.
So maybe, Joan, if you'll indulge me, I'll maybe just offer a brief comment on the previous and then talk about productivity. So I would just say on competitiveness, I think, certainly I as an official agree that's a really important part of resiliency, and actually businesses that are more competitive and have to survive in a much more difficult market in the end often tend to be more successful and profitable and so on. But competition policy, this is going to be a bit wonkish, it's really only about 100 years old. Like there was a time when being competitive meant you were the biggest player around and everyone had to deal with you and there were no other competitors because you put them out of business.
Yes.
And the emergence of competition policy was to try to set some balance between consumers and businesses, creating a level playing field. That's a construct that society has created that isn't there naturally. And there is a debate to be held, and it's not to say we don't want competitiveness, because absolutely we do. And in fact, the government has made amendments to the legislation to try to stimulate a more competitive and dynamic market. But there are some risks that the logical outcome for some companies might be, it'd be better to have the manufacturing offshore because it's actually a lot cheaper to do that. And so the competitive drive might actually kind of be, and in the pharmaceutical space, in the life science space, huge revolutionary changes in the last few years. And I'd agree that Canada has this huge advantage in the sense that, during the pandemic, a lot of countries had export controls. Europe had actually passed legislation enabling them to impose export controls. Our earliest doses of vaccines came from Europe. And we were lucky because they agreed not to do that to us. But if Europe had put export controls in place, we would have initially had trouble getting vaccines. Having the manufacturing capacity here, in addition to the innovation and the brains and all that stuff, it turned out to be really important. And the government of Canada has a whole strategy to try to reinvigorate and invest both in the kind of the brains and the knowledge side, but also the manufacturing, to be able to make stuff at scale. Because in an emergency, you actually want to have that part of the supply chain here. And as it turns out, having the government play a role turns out to be really important, because if you just let the market roll, you're not necessarily guaranteed to get it. So competitiveness is really important, but there are these other policy objectives, and I wouldn't claim that I personally have the right answer, but the thinking, I think, of governments around the world the last number of years is like, what's the right kind of mix of policies to try to get resiliency and competitiveness? On productivity, I guess I would say, I don't want to sound glib. It's a very important issue. The Deputy Senior Governor of the bank has raised this as an issue, quite well known, her comments on this. The government has talked about this as an issue in the budget. But I would just remark, maybe on a note of cautious optimism, that this is an issue that we've been talking about for many decades. Like it's from the day that I arrived in Ottawa as a kid, like a long time ago, to today, much of the content of the debate hasn't changed. Our business sector are generally slower to adopt technology. We've always had this gap with the US. So that's not to say, well, it'll always be there, so what? I mean, actually, really, we've got to maybe double down and do more. But I would say during that entire period, if you look at the kind of policies multiple governments have pursued across the political spectrum, significant deregulation, significant privatization of what you might call state industry. I mean, there was a time in this country when the railroad, the telephone company, the national airline, the National Petroleum Company, like there was a much greater involvement of government in the affairs of the economy. A lot of that has been spun out. That's now the private sector. There's been significant tax reform with the introduction of a value-added tax by the Mulroney administration, and we've had probably the most ambitious trade agenda of any country on the planet, with more free trade agreements than anybody. And all through these major structural changes in the economy, tax, regulation, privatization, free trade, our productivity issue has continued apace, which I think tells you something that it's not just, it's something about the industrial structure of the country. We're a country largely made of small business. We are a country that for many decades, as I noted, relied on expansion of the labor force and resources. We are moving rapidly into a world where a lot of the factors of advantage are going to be around technology adoption, AI, the ability to use resources in ways that are far more efficient with less environmental exposure and so on. So the good news is we do have rule of law and we do have stability, hugely valuable. We do have vast resources for the clean economy of tomorrow, all the critical minerals. We have one of the most highly educated populations in the world. I'm personally convinced, to be sure, the support from governments for some of these massive investments has been important. I mean, there are CFOs and companies who look at the balance sheet and they make calculations partly based on the numbers. But my experience dealing with these large companies is they're very keen to be here because of all of the advantages that have been discussed earlier. And so I think we have, as I say, a note of optimism would be, we've had this problem. It's a secular problem that's been there a long time. I'm not sure there's a magic bullet. Anybody who claims to have a magic bullet, please send me your business card. like to figure out what that is. But there are also potentially enormous opportunities for us in a rapidly changing world where we have a lot of stuff to offer people. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay.
So yeah, I would love, maybe I'll comment on that. I think what's interesting on this productivity issue and why Canada, the productivity issue is bad and it's getting worse. I was at an event earlier this morning and somebody said, recent stats say that Canada is one of the worst performing countries in terms of the productivity, change in our productivity over the last several years. What's interesting is what is driving productivity is technology. And if you look at our major stock indexes, about 10 to 15% of the value is from technology companies. In the US, it's twice that. The most valuable companies in the world, the companies that are driving innovation, they are based in the US, and we don't have enough in Canada. So then I think it becomes a question, okay, how can we foster the tech environment in Canada? How can we create more great companies? And I'm sort of hesitating, don't know if I want to necessarily open the wound, but the whole capital gains tax structure I can tell you, I mean, I'm sure you've heard a lot from the tech community that are saying this is going to be the death nail, right? And I will say on a very, I don't need to repeat all the arguments, but I know CEOs of companies, I know one CEO of a company that I'm trying to persuade him not to move his company. He has 2,000 people located in Canada. He is so upset, he's like, we're going to move our company. We're going to move our company. I'm saying, please don't move your company. But, we need to, and it's not just a capital gains tax, but it's other things. What can the government and what can we all, frankly, be doing to change that number so that we become much more of a technology-based economy, because that is where we need to move.
Okay, thank you for that. Shots fired. I love it. So building on that, because I think, so not only is there the competition to keep the company here, but everybody's early remarks, I think everybody on the panel has mentioned all the great talent that we have in this country, including on this panel. But how do we keep the talent here? Like, you have to keep the company here, but like Trevor, you said, you're pitching other parts of Ontario, but that means they can go anywhere, right? They're not just looking at major city centers, and they're not just looking at Ontario. So I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this first. But are we doing enough to keep talent here, whether it's Ontario, which is your remit, Trevor, or Canada more broadly?
Yeah, no, what I would, absolutely. So our greatest force, right, is talent. I think that's one of the major differentiators in the space. On the flip side, you're seeing talent crunches, right, as a consequence of demand on particular certain areas. And we can point to AI, you can point to the tech sector to some degree, you can point to life sciences in terms of the growth factor on these companies. I think, from my perspective, what I try to do is secure the right kinds of investors in this province to create the jobs that keep people here. The focus of the agency really is to go and help those strategic investments that are game-changing, whether it's a supply chain gap or a technology company that isn't here playing in the space, or to help create the next Shopify or OpenText or Magna or Linamar, because that's where the real value of jobs and the jobs of the future are created, is to help them facilitate making those jumps. Like, how do I work with a unicorn company that's on a high growth trajectory perspective and say, how do I make you get to that next level and create the jobs of the future? And that's, for me, it's a bit of a rising tide floats all boats, and I see that as a big part of the solution with keeping people here. And, to some degree, yes, you're seeing there was always historically the brain drain from classic places like Waterloo to California, but we've seen a bit of a reversal from that perspective. I certainly say that certainly there's been a reversal out of California, definitely. And so I think part of what we try to do is focus on the opportunities in order to keep people here.
Yeah, well, let's hope it's not a pendulum. We're almost out of time, so I want to give everybody an opportunity. So we have a wonderful audience online. We have a wonderful audience here in the building. Many of them sit on the boards of charities, of private companies. They're senior leaders in business. What is your call to action on this topic of resiliency and all the kind of enablers and adjacencies that we've talked about in terms of competitiveness and talent? Berkeley, I'm going to start with you.
So I'm going to surprise nobody and remind us that health is the ultimate resiliency.
Yes.
And I think that's true individually. And again, getting these best medicines and treatments to the Canadians who need them is really a key part of that resiliency. Yeah. But industrially, geopolitically, health is also, I think, a fantastically wide open opportunity for Canada as a resiliency. I think there's all the opportunities to be an ever more important player in that space. And with that comes, many of the important transitions that we've talked about today.
Thank you. Trevor.
So I recently had a conversation with one of the key site selectors globally. And site selectors are basically people, they're commercial real estate entities that are basically, there's 50 of them that are really the significant industrial siters in this North America. And this person told me that the impetus to come to North America, he has never seen anything like it in the 30 years that he's been in the space. My agency right now is tracking $77 billion worth of investment opportunities for this province. What I would say to the business community here is, and that's not just foreign direct investment, that's domestic companies too, right? What I'd say to you is I know it's important for you to think globally when you're expanding. You can't be successful unless you go to other countries. I get it. But I still think that there's a unique mix, and I'd like you to also consider making investments in Ontario as part of that growth, and that we're here to help you do that.
Thank you. Janet.
And I would say two things. I would say, first of all, to the extent that you are a business leader, think about how can you adopt technology more quickly? How can you move faster? How can you become much more competitive by leveraging technology? Number one. Number two, for all the Canadians, which I assume everybody is and online, is don't give up on our country. I know not everything is perfect. When I talk to a lot of people today, I have a sense of, just sort of almost frustration that I've never sensed before in this country. And I say, we cannot give up. We cannot give up. We love our country. It's our obligation to dig in and to help our country and to help it help it improve and address some of the issues that we've talked about today.
Simon, last word.
So I would say maybe a version of Janet's just to start, which is, by many metrics, I'm happy to give some later for those who are interested. I mean, there are many, many people around the world who would trade places with us in a heartbeat. By many, many measures, we are still one of the best places, if not the best place in the world to live. And in relative terms, there are a lot of the problems we're talking about today are problems that other countries are struggling with as well. So I do think sometimes we have it's kind of a very charming Canadian tendency sometimes to sort of focus on all the things that aren't going right, but there are so many things that are going really well. It's obviously maybe dangerous sometimes for officials or people from Ottawa to say, hey, everything's great, because you want to know that we're working on the things that are problematic. But just to say, I think there is much to be optimistic about. So maybe that's point one. On the issue of what boards should be thinking about, two quick things. One would be, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the world is being refashioned as under our feet. Like that there are huge tectonic shifts. Automotive is a very visible one in Ontario, but I could tell you an equal story in a whole bunch of other sectors. There are tremendous opportunities to partner with allies, and there are new business opportunities as these supply chains are being rebuilt in sector after sector. And I do a lot of travel, and I have been struck. I mean, people are always happy to talk to Canada, and we have lots of people who take us very seriously and want to talk to us. But the volume of kind of major allied countries and massive corporations and others who are eager to talk. We want to work with Canada. How do we work with Canada? We want to do more with Canada. So I think there is enormous opportunity out there. If you're looking for it, big changes going on. How do you seize those? The second one, and I'll just draw just a lesson from a very prominent Toronto business person I won't name, but just I'm stealing this idea. But they say, if you're on a board, you really need to be paying attention to artificial intelligence, even if you're on a not-for-profit board or whatever, and you need to be thinking about how do you use this to better your business. And the risks of not thinking about it are actually potentially outweighed by like somebody else is going to take advantage of this technology and is going to put you out of business and eat your lunch. So the risk of standing still doesn't mean there aren't risks with AI. I would urge you to be very cautious and responsible. But the risk of kind of just sort of worrying that if we adopt it, it's going to cause problems are probably outweighed by the risk that this is a tidal wave coming at you and you got to figure out what to do with it. And I have just one last admission. In my own organization, which is a very large organization, it's very resource intensive. We have a lot of people, doing things with processes you might imagine are not as modern as they should be. I was struck by how easy it was to adopt off-the-shelf artificial intelligence, technologies that are available now and are tested and actually have the ability to strip a lot of inefficiency. I wouldn't claim that we've figured it out, but it's not as rocket science-y as you think. It's actually a lot closer to the front line, and if you spend a little bit of effort, I'm convinced you can get a pretty solid return. So I would just say, I think you got to pay attention to AI. That would be my last little piece of advice.
Well, one of my most favorite things about Canada, and one of the reasons it makes me optimistic, is having wonderful conversations like this with so many talented, thoughtful people who can respectfully disagree and find common ground. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel.
So this is perhaps my last Canadian Club that I'll host as a board member. It's been 7 years, and finally Colleen told me that I can stand up straight instead of leaning over the podium. So I'll try to do that this last time. On behalf of the Canadian Club of Toronto, I want to thank Janet, Trevor, Simon, and Barclay for providing, Simon from Ottawa, for providing a positive and inspiring perspective on the exceptionally hopeful view of Canada's economic resilience. Canada is a leader in many key areas of our economic activity and growth, from natural resources to the green economy, from science and tech to stability, diversity, and governance, even international trade. As you pointed out, with clear and captivating examples, we're a destination of choice for investors, companies, and those who want to start a new life here. Canada is in an enviable position, even if the chattering classes don't always suggest as much, from green to digital to resilience. I think it's important for us to recognize these examples and build confidence. We thank you for the leadership role that each of you play in bolstering our great nation as an economic powerhouse. It is confidence in ourselves, pride in our talent, and competitiveness as a nation that is going to result in the investment that you all seek and that will continue to come if we can maintain that confidence, pride, and competitiveness. Please accept our best wishes for continued success in your respective roles. Jody, thank you for skillfully moderating this great discussion. We look forward to having you back. Before we conclude, I want to encourage you to visit our website, canadianclub.org, for details about our events. We have a busy spring ahead of us. We hope to see you again soon. On May 23rd, we'll host the 2024 Private Equity Outlook with panelists from Hoop, Fengate, Brookfield, and Kensington Partners. On May 30th, we'll host a discussion on employer-funded healthcare featuring the CEO of Dialogue and the president of Sun Life Health. On June 5th, we'll host a conversation on how reconciliation is progressing on Bay Street. And speaking of Bay Street, we'll hear from the CEO of Scotiabank, Scott Thompson, on June 6th. Let me conclude by thanking our AV supplier, BBC Live, for its steadfast and outstanding AV support. Members and guests, thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.